How big is too big? All this and more coming up on This Week in Retro.
High-resolution color graphics.
This land of high technology.
The revolution in technology that made the information age possible.
Those kids are not afraid of computers.
We've seen the future.
They're rewriting the past.
Ooh, that's a big one.
All this and more coming up on this week's show.
Up-to-date news for out-of-date tech.
Hello, twirlers, and welcome to the first This Week in Retro of 2025. Still got to get used to writing that new year. It gets harder every year, doesn't it? Writing the correct year when it comes to writing dates. I think I
never get it wrong. I would never get it wrong.
Got stuck or no. You'll never get it wrong. As you'll see in the first outtakes of 2025 at the end of the year. Speaking of which, we hope you enjoyed the outtakes. Duncan put up his collection of outtakes around Christmas time. I certainly enjoyed it. I forgot half of them, especially the one where your, is it Alexa that you've got kicks in?
Yes. It's the Google Home, yeah, but yeah.
And asks for your autograph because you're so famous.
The Bros one. I particularly enjoyed the Valiant Turtle one.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I'd forgotten all about that. That was, it couldn't have gone better. But thank you for sticking with us last year. And this year, we've got a packed show to start off the year as well.
Packed show, a flurry of new patrons for the year. So thank you, everyone, for signing up. We'll cover that in Dave's briefs halfway through, or Dave's housekeeping, wherever that sits. And of course, just a happy new year to everyone. Dave, you're young and energetic. How did you spend your new year? There were cancellations, weren't there, in Scotland with the fireworks and such?
Yeah, the Hogmanay celebrations in Edinburgh were cancelled because of inclement weather. It was very, very windy, so that was cancelled. I'm too old to go out and get drunk at New Year now. I don't do it anymore. I had a quiet New Year playing Fallout 4.
Nice.
I wasn't particularly well. You weren't well either.
No,
we're both over the worst of it. I think you're slightly under the weather still.
Yeah, just cold upon cold. There's a lot going around at the moment, and I can't blame the child because they haven't been to preschool for 3 weeks, so I don't know where it's come from. But yeah, but onwards and upwards will be fine. So into the new year, lots coming up on this week's show. I did actually start work last week when I was editing up a wonderful talk about the history of Firebird, which was British Telecom, our national phone network, set up a software publishing business in the 80s. And Richard Hewison, the author of a book called Memories of Firebird, came and gave us a wonderful talk, which I've edited up. And it's a real hour-long deep dive into the history of Firebird. And I really enjoyed editing that. When these talks happen in the cave, I really enjoy the process of editing them again and taking in everything that I missed first time round. So, I think that's a good sign. If I'm enjoying it, then it should make for a good episode for people to watch and enjoy.
Yeah.
There you go, Firebird, which always makes me think of Booty.
Makes me think of Runestone.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Hot Runestone, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember Ian Lee?
Who?
Ian Lee.
Yes, of course I do.
Off the telly.
Hello, Ian.
He's asked me to be a guest on his new returning podcast.
Oh, he's
Random
doing a
Access
second
Memories.
series.
He's restarting it, so I'll be recording that later on today. I imagine he'll get it out before this week's episode.
He's very quick at turning around content, isn't he? Bang,
Yeah,
it's done.
Well, he's a professional, unlike us. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
We have to rely on Duncan to sort it out for us, because you haven't got a clue about video editing, do you?
No, not a clue. Not a clue. I know. I do know enough to know how much effort that Duncan will have to put in to do all this. Duncan actually told us he was working on editing on Christmas Day, didn't he?
I know. He told he was going to do it, and we both said, no, don't do it.
Don't do that. Put your feet up, Duncan. Have a day off. But no, he's a machine.
I think he obviously enjoys it, though. So this is recreation of some sort. So if you're off, then you do what you like.
Yeah. And then Dave slid the tray of food under his door.
I always kick the door to let him know I've done it so he can have it when it's hot.
Oh, poor Duncan. Poor Duncan. Right. Lots to cover because we've got a few weeks worth of submissions to the subreddit to cover. Lots going on. So should we get into the first story, Dave?
Yeah, let's get started. Neil, do you remember the cyberspace riots of 2005?
Oh, I was at the front row. Yeah.
It's 20 years ago, but it feels I've almost forgotten about them. Well, that was a prediction in 1995 from Tomorrow's World, a UK TV programme. They tried to predict what changes would happen 30 years from 1995, and we're going to go through that today with them, Neil. With them? We're going to go through them with you,
You're
Neil,
going to go through them?
Oh, dear. Tomorrow's World was a TV show on the BBC that ran from 1965 until it petered out in 2003.
Was it that early? 1965?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
It was a very positive and optimistic show every week about developments in science and technology. Does that sound familiar, Neil?
Sounds familiar. I was just checking because it's such a long-running show, or was, 1965. Doctor Who started in 1963. So there's sort of a theme of futurism and optimism and sci-fi and science in the 60s. There's a buzz about that. And, of course, the space race will tie into that.
And sometimes you hear us in this show talk about clips that have been submitted to the subreddit, and often they come from Tomorrow's World. They had loads of presenters over the years, and pretty much any technological innovation would have been on Tomorrow's World before we finally saw it. But of course, lots of things that didn't work out and never came to market. It was extremely popular. At its peak in the 70s, it was getting 10 million viewers a week. And for that type of show, that's incredible. Even by the end, it was still getting 3 million viewers. Submitted by It's Tomorrow Now, who has a fantastic username for this, is a BBC article titled 30 Years Ago, Tomorrow's World Predicted 2025. How did it go? And in this article, they review what Tomorrow's World predicted to see if they got it right. Now, the first thing on the list is the cyberspace riots of 2005. Obviously, they didn't happen, and they got this one wrong.
Were these riots predicted to happen in cyberspace or as a result of what was going on in cyberspace?
I'm not quite sure. I think it was outside of cyberspace. I think it was real riots. And the cause for it, though, they predicted business barons and banks would control the internet by 2000 and establish a supernet which they restricted access to. Now, that's a bit of a sci-fi dystopian trope, but they're obviously definitely off the mark there. But we have seen a bit of a commercialization of the internet since 2000. We've talked about how it used to be in maybe 1998, you would go to all sorts of different URLs, different web pages, all made from scratch. But these days, we pretty much stay to a top 10 list of internet sites.
And you could argue that that path has been gone down in certain regions. So, for example, in China, the way that the internet is accessed and the control over, there is what supposedly, without getting into politics too deeply, Mr. Musk is trying to recreate with X, which is social media, banking, just all of the services wrapped into one site.
What AOL failed to do. Yeah,
which is what X is trying to recreate.
Yeah.
It didn't happen in 2000, but I don't think they're that far off the mark as in terms of what people would want to do with it. Certain people want to do with it.
They've got a thread to it. Certainly these days we tend to go to our social media sites, we go to the news sites, and we go to YouTube and Twitch maybe, and then there's not so many other sites, whereas 1998, the internet was so fragmented.
Yeah. News is, all brought into one place, like Reddit, for example. Yeah.
Next is super surgeons and the robots that they use to operate on holograms. So no, they didn't get that one right either, but they kind of did. The idea was that a surgeon themselves would operate on a hologram and a remote robot would mimic the movements on the patient. So that way you wouldn't need to go to hospital. And that's not a million miles away from using VR to operate remotely. And although the BBC say they got it wrong, there is something called telesurgery, and VR is used for that. So it kind of is happening, but instead of it being done remotely on the patient, it means that the surgeon can do it remotely. The surgeon doesn't have to be in the hospital. Asteroid mining. They predicted we'd be mining near-Earth asteroids for precious metals. And again, they didn't get that right. But to give them some credit for predicting how mobile phones would run down our resources of some precious metals, there will be a point at which it becomes more attractive because there's less precious metals available.
I feel like we've had plenty of news stories about asteroids passing the Earth and the quantity of precious metals that are on them and a desire to mine them. But it's certainly too far away from... When was this predicted for?
This is
2025.
2025, yeah.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet to hop on an asteroid and mine it.
No.
But again, the desire is there and the technology is going that way, I would say.
Yeah, as soon as we have a space elevator, as soon as we don't need to use a rocket to get in and out of space, then we'll be sorted.
Like Wallace and Gromit style fishing net that flips up, catches the asteroid.
Yeah, that technology I'm sure is viable.
Yeah.
The BBC did ask Tim Cheesewright about it, who's an expert. He says, the potential riches are unfathomable and the technology is entirely within our grasp.
Are you telling me Tim Cheesewright is not a Wallace and Gromit character?
Well, when you said Wallace and Gromit, I smiled because I knew I was going to say Cheesewright. Next, they predicted smart speakers, but with talking hologram heads. The smart speakers we did get, but thankfully no annoying heads coming out. Although I'm going to say they only really predicted Holly from Red Dwarf, which had already been around for years by the time that was done.
Do you know, I think we might get it. I think it might happen because we've seen in recent weeks some clips of a volumetric display. Mm-hmm. So a display that can do holograms. We've got smart speakers. It wouldn't take much to combine the two. I think that could happen.
I don't know we'd want it though on a smart speaker.
That's not the point. It doesn't matter if anyone wants it or not. Yeah.
Next, they say banking will be done by a tiny chip and it will be embedded in our arms. I guess apart from being embedded in our arms, they've got this right because we do use a tiny chip for banking and now we use a tiny virtual chip in our phones for banking.
Or smartwatches.
Yeah.
A little bit of banking. So it's kind of on your arm.
Your smartwatch again? That's a fantastic one.
No, it's in my arm, Dave. That's why you can't see it. It's in my arm.
I've got a cheap one. I wonder if there's a mixed result here. I think, being honest, they did get a lot right, and it was maybe just the glamming it up for TV to sound controversial that they got wrong. But what I noticed, Neil, that was they had grand visions, and lots of the stuff that they said was happening even sooner than 30 years didn't happen. And I wonder if that's because of the way that things changed in the 30 years leading up to this. If you think about the changes from 1965 to 1995, the changes there were perhaps bigger than the changes now. But what do you think, Neil? Do you have any predictions will it happen in the next 30 years?
Well, I know I missed Tomorrow's World. I really loved that programme. And even when it died out, when they cancelled it, I don't remember it being like in the doldrums or being tired or anything. I still enjoyed it. I was kind of annoyed that they got rid of it, and I think they should bring back Tomorrow's World. They weren't the only ones predicting the future. The Osborne Book of the Future was published in the 1970s and republished recently, so you can still get hold of that, and they've got some lovely predictions. Of course, they're predicting that everything that currently existed in the 70s will be smaller, faster, more powerful. Moore's law, of course, as you love, Dave, applies to these things. And it's much more difficult to predict those sharp turns in technology that maybe happen once a decade or even longer that catch us by surprise. For example, in the book, there's a video phone watch, and it looks like a normal watch with a small CRT TV on, and this hilarious assembly of aerials sticking out the top of the watch, like you would put on the top of an old TV set. And, you know, that's technologies that existed then, only smaller. They, Tomorrow's World talked about VR surgery, but they didn't predict nanobots, for example. These, you know, how would you have predicted that? You'd have to be really out there. But there are people that make great predictions, like I think
Nostradamus.
I wasn't going to go that far back. I was going to say Arthur C. Clarke and people like that. There's plenty of clips on YouTube.
I should say I don't mean Nostradamus. Nostradamus, what people do is they go through what he said and they try and make it fit. Yes. Arthur C. Clarke, yes, though.
Yeah, great thinkers like that have really thought through the social impact of technology, perhaps a bit more than it will get smaller and a chip will go in your arm, thinking about those impacts. So it's well worth watching those. But coming back to your question, I think if Tomorrow's World was on the telly today, a week wouldn't go by when we don't have an AI story, of course, at the moment, and how that would play out in the next 30 years. I imagine AI would be reported with great optimism, great hope, little bit of warning, but mostly hope and optimism. And they would tell us that AI is going to unshackle us from our mundane jobs and make everything wonderful, just like the mechanization of the farm industry and all of these other technological advances. So my prediction is that none of that will happen at all. When it comes to AI, any benefits will be harnessed by the super rich. We'll get to enjoy a dystopian future of Amazon Prime Android units that we subscribe to. And in 30 years, we'll be paying an AI tax, just like we pay road tax. Is that a nice, cheery prediction to start the year off, Dave?
I get what you're saying. And I've seen that cartoon that keeps popping up with people redoing it, where they're saying, I wanted AI to do the mundane tasks so I could do art, and now AI does the art, and I'm left doing the mundane tasks. But there are things where AI will help. Things like you go and see your GP, and AI is there along with your GP, and AI says, hang on a minute, all these symptoms together, all these things together put this particular person at risk of this. AI blood testing, all sorts of things there. There are AI things I think will help. The problem is, of course, the money going to these oligarchs.
Even more mundane things like having customer service that actually picks up the phone and talks to you. I think we've all experienced the quality of first-line customer service declining as jobs are squeezed and profits are increased. And we've also experienced, some of us, automated phone systems that incorporate a bit of AI. We see videos of driving through drive-thrus at McDonald's where AI is taking your order in certain restaurants now. And it's a bit janky, but it won't take long before that's pretty seamless and actually useful. I don't like the personal element being taken away and being able to go off script to get the help that you need. I won't go into detail, but I spent 2 weeks over the Christmas period trying to get through to someone that could help me with the childcare credit that we get in this country because a code had been taken away and there was lots going on. It was impossible to get hold of anyone. And if there was some AI that worked sufficiently to talk to me, converse with me, figure out my problem and fix it, I'd be absolutely happy with that.
Yeah, I get what you're saying about the AI. I just hope it means things like toilet cleaning and so on is done by AI robots, that kind of thing, rather than we end up doing that while the AI makes our television and films for us.
Make motorway service toilets great again.
Yeah.
That's what AI can do. Right. Self-driving cars. That's an easy one to predict, isn't it? 30 years' time, I think we will have self-driving cars.
Are you going to predict television next?
But I think televisions in cars, Dave. No, to go with this, the entire road network, my prediction, will be unrecognizable. You won't be able to drive on it at all manually. It will be impossible because it will be built for the self-driving systems and not for a piece of meat sitting behind a steering wheel. There'll be new taxes to reflect this, just as I think there'll be taxes on AI. There'll be plenty of taxes. And finally, Mars will be populated. The most liked social media post of 2055, Dave, will be a video of the first person running Doom on Mars. Second most liked video will be someone watching Total Recall on Mars, and they will be taxed to post these videos. So, but the most exciting thing I think we'll have by 2055, Dave, is the thing that all of humanity has been collectively working towards all these years. The thing that will solve all of our problems, a passable alternative to a CRT TV using technology that's available. I'll be able to take it, cut it to size with a pair of scissors, stretch it across the glass of a dead CRT. Power and video will be wireless, no lag. You won't be able to tell the difference. I'll just be able to use arts and crafts, cut and paste literally a display onto a CRT, and you won't be able to tell the difference. That's what I want in 30 years.
More than that later.
And it will be taxed. And I keep bringing up taxes because then at least I will be correct in some form with my predictions. You will be taxed.
Death and taxes, the two things that are inevitable. The big thing I think they really didn't get right They didn't get it right. They weren't close on. And the signs were there in 1995, is that we'd be carrying a little device that did everything for us, our mobile phone. The mobile phone has been incredible over the past 30 years. The things it allows us to do. We hold the entire internet in our hand. We've got AI in it. We can take pictures, all sorts of stuff, and they didn't touch on that at all, I think. Anyway, it is an interesting article, an interesting video. Link in the show notes. We are sponsored today by Sega Mania magazine.
Who?
Sega Mania.
Sega Mania?
It's a new sponsor, Neil. A new sponsor for the new year.
Sega Mania?
Sega Mania, Sega Mania, or Sega Mania. Sega-mania.com. Sega Mania is the most official of unofficial Sega magazines, and issue 8 is ready after nearly a year and a half hiatus and a successful Kickstarter funding. It's a clever concept for a magazine. They cover Sega stuff, all of it, and they do it in chronological order. So they started with issue 1 in 1990. Not in 1990, but they started in, I think, 2021, but they started covering 1990 of Sega in their issue 1 of the magazine. The new issue, issue 8, is the second half of 1995. Is that peak Sega, Neil? 1995.
That Saturn era, isn't it? You're coming into a period that I know a little bit less about because I was a real Mega Drive or...
The Mega Drive was still going strong in 1995, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Or if you're in America, the Guinnesses. That's a good reason for me to buy issue 8 so I can bone up on the Saturn era, the 1995 era.
Yeah. They write it in the old Sega magazine tongue-in-cheek way, so much so that they write it ostensibly as if they were writing it in the 90s, mostly. You can get back issues. They do this neat batch system where when enough people have ordered a back issue, they get printed.
Or there's the digital versions.
Yeah, the digital versions as well. And the batches have all just been restarted in anticipation of issue 8. So it's all happening. They're a non-profit setup. Any profits they make are used to get the next magazine going, and they don't pay themselves. So jump in and get issue 8, prime Sega time. And thanks to Sega Mania, This Week in Retro listeners and viewers who want to try it for the first time can get 10% off issue 8 by using the code TWIR, This Week in Retro, TWIR10 at the checkout. Go and do it. Be part of something and get something to hold in your hand. Sega-mania.com.
In our history of over 200 shows, if there's something that has popped up as regularly as Ultima, there's our first count for the year.
First of the year.
It's the reminder of the great video game crash of 1983, which was not universally experienced, and yet it's often overstated as hard fact. The world of video games ground to a halt. It took Nintendo and the NES to save the day, and so on and so on. When in reality, here in the UK and in other regions, the country was abuzz with microcomputer sales and games. We were oblivious to it, and business was booming. In Japan, for example, they referred to that period of US games history as Atari shock, as Atari lost its dominant position in the US market. Why are we talking about it today, though? Well, an interesting blog post was shared on the subreddit entitled The Gentrification of Video Game History by Philippe Pepe. In it, he talks of an RPG expo he visited, which included all the usual suspects, Final Fantasy, Wizardry, other RPGs, but also many games produced in Taiwan and played by millions of players in that region, but rarely seen in the West as they weren't translated. This leads him to reflect on the US media dominating conversations and reflecting their own interests and experiences, which for obvious reasons excludes large swathes of video game history because they simply don't know it exists, and why would they? Did you know, for example, that a game called Free Fire currently has 150 million daily players? Probably not, because it's a mobile game created and popular in Vietnam. Or that India, with a population of 4 times that of the US, have had huge hits with cricket games like Real Cricket 20, which has been downloaded over 50 million times. It seems more important now than ever to make sure that the history books reflect the reality of the games industry internationally, and it doesn't default to the experience of the loudest voices. India, China, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, life behind the Iron Curtain even. These places and times all have their own game history and cultural memories, but it's rarely communicated. Philippe does go on to cite how Europe's home computer scene of the 80s is often replaced by events in North America, and the Amstrad CPC, C64, ZX Spectrum, Amiga, and things that revolve around these systems, the demo scene, for example, get replaced by the Nintendo NES. Let's not forget the Atari ST too, Dave. That should be in there. If that's happening,
first on the list.
Should be first in the list. If that's happening to Europe, he says, just imagine the rest of the world. Philippe talks about the difference between LAN parties and LAN houses, different licensing models which apply to regions where you are unlikely to be able to afford a computer. So why would you buy games? Imagine, for example, regions where there's no nostalgia for boxed vintage video games because they were free to play as part of, well, not free, you would pay to go to an internet cafe and it would be as part of that payment to get in there. Now, why has Philippe been motivated to write about all this? Quite simply because he feels his own experiences, his own personal truth and his own history with video games is being erased, that the opinion of those with the loudest voices are making out that his memories don't matter or his memories are less valuable in some way. In 100 years, will the birth of the industry be concentrated down to Atari, Nintendo, Sega, Sony, or will there be a more complete and nuanced history that bubbles up to the surface and reflects all regions? And how will the future of AI-generated content, back to AI again, present this history if it's training and amplifying news produced by itself based on a biased timeline originally that's already out there? This is important stuff, and it's why we've always flagged up on this show when these things come up. And I think why you've upvoted and felt compelled to comment on this particular submission on the subreddit. The story speaks to you, and I understand why. Dave, does this story speak to you? What do you make of this article? Is Scotland at risk of being erased from video game history?
It's a really, really interesting article. I want to start off with the great video games crash. And on the one hand, we simply cannot understate the impact of it. I really like the phrase Atari shock because it describes it without taking anything away from it, but also without implying that it affected everywhere. The Fulton brothers of the excellent podcast Into the Vertical Blank really opened my eyes to it. They were just the right age to be right into the Atari boom. When it happened, the Atari boom rather than the crash, they were right into the boom. It was all they lived and breathed. It was all that mattered to them, and things were just fantastic. And then it all came crashing down. And that's it. I'm using the word traumatic. I don't know if they've said the word traumatic, but I would say what they've described, without using hyperbole, say it sounds traumatic to them. So we shouldn't say that their memories didn't happen. But at the same time, it didn't happen for us. In 1983, the Spectrum, the Commodore 64, we had the Amstrad coming next year. We had this fantastic thing happening in the UK. It was just taking off thanks to the Computer Literacy Project, thanks to the BBC Micro. So we just didn't have it.
And a part of that Atari shock was the flooding of low-quality games on cartridge for their consoles, whereas the ZX Spectrum wasn't without low-quality games, but we had that balance of low-cost tapes. Budget games eventually came, not in 83, but they would soon come, and games were more affordable. So if the market had some rubbish games, we just went, okay, buy the next one.
So we had this amazing thing happening alongside it. But the problem is there's always a push to reduce history down to one single narrative. So in 1983, Atari really did crash hard. Massive losses, not just losses that were reported in the games industry. This was headline news across the USA, and worldwide, incredible losses. So you can't ignore that, and it becomes the biggest story. And if you write about that in 1983, if you say that's what was really happening in 1983, you tend not to write about other things. The UK micro scene is often left out, and in fact, the whole micro scene in general is often left out in favour of consoles because that's what people think about. And when they look at a history of gaming, they start with the Nintendo. RPGs, you mentioned that before. laughably so, but in two ways. First of all, you have JRPGs, which were initially just borrowed from Ultima and Wizardry. People in Japan, in fact, some Americans in Japan, played Ultima and Wizardry and said, we can do that over here. But they did go their own way. They entwined their own stories and myths into it. But you'll find coverage that just doesn't acknowledge that they came from Ultima and Wizardry as the progenitors of JRPG. Then you'll have things flip right around. Some JRPGs are legendary, like Earthbound, or should I say Earthbound 2, because that's confusing, because Earthbound is known as Earthbound 2, I think, in Japan, because it was the sequel to, I think it was called Mother 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. But why is it legendary? Because it got a translation and the prequel didn't. The one before it didn't, first in the series. So unless a game made it in the US, like this article said, it just didn't get reported on, doesn't get into the history. And then you go back to the British stuff and you either get it omitted entirely, or you get this weird thing where people talk about the history of gaming and then say, oh yeah, and the Brits had the Spectrum.
Yeah.
It does get unified, though, when it comes to console gaming in the kind of past the 16-bit era, where you had things like Rare and you had DMA design going into consoles, and then all of a sudden, British developers are a huge deal. MUDs get erased as well. Multi-user domains, or multi-user dungeons, which you want to call it, get erased. They were really important and basically massively multiplayer online role-playing games with a graphical skin on them, but they don't get talked about now.
Are they just not sexy enough? Is there an element of that? Micro's not sexy, console's sexy.
I don't know. But MUDs, again, are erased. As for Scotland, though, no chance. Roller Coaster Tycoon, Lemmings, and GTA. We won't be forgotten thanks to them. But anything before Lemmings tends to be an afterthought, like the whole rest of the UK scene. I will try to be reasonable here, though. It's very hard to tell a whole story on anything. Where do you draw the lines? We have this problem on this show, Neil. When we tell a story, people will often comment and say they'll add a bit of information, but sometimes they'll word it in a way as if we should have included it. And we can't. Where do you draw the lines? Where do you stop? If you talk about the Soviet side of things, you talk about the South American side of things. If you don't, you're doing an injustice to them. But then what about public domain? All these things, you can't do everything. So you have to draw a line somewhere. And that's why it ends up being slightly reduced. And you end up with what the worry is that AI will just amplify that effect. And you end up with, well, in the before times, that was all rubbish. And it crashed, and then Nintendo came and saved the day. And then there was also Sega, but it wasn't as popular as Nintendo, and then the PlayStation.
Yeah, and it was such a different landscape over here. Yes, we got the NES in, was it 87 in Europe, I think, sometime around then. Yes, I had a friend who had a ZX Spectrum and then traded that in, sold it, and bought an NES. But that was, they were few and far between, the NES owners that I knew from my personal experience. I don't know about you. When was the first time you saw an NES?
I saw one at one of my neighbours' houses. His dad worked in the oil industry and had too much money, so would buy any toys going, and he got an NES for Christmas, and he told everybody he got an NES for Christmas. You didn't get in his house usually, but you got in his house to see his NES.
Right. And then,
everyone else had an Amstrad.
Yeah. And then there was crossover, like the guy who had the NES had it at the same time as a lot of my friends had Mega Drives, and the Super Nintendo then came along. And then go to another region, the PC Engine was like the second biggest console, I believe, in Japan. So there's all these different threads, all these different stories. And yeah, I think it's important that we keep flagging it and we keep highlighting it and we encourage others to do. And we applaud people like our good friends, the Amigos, who are based in the US and celebrate the history of micros, US and UK, and their importance in the games industry. And we encourage you to do the same. Next time someone says the great video games crash of 83, what should they do, Dave?
They should say, do you mean Atari Shock?
And then slap them.
No, again, no, I can't say that, because having listened to the Fulton brothers explain their side of it, it's so true for them, and we can't take that away from them. I don't know how to solve it. That's why I like the phrase Atari Shock, because it's clearer about what happened.
We shouldn't try and take away their truth just to justify our own. They're all just as valid. But works both ways, doesn't it? So thank you very much for that submission. And you can find the link to that in the show notes. You can read other people's comments on that. And you can submit your own stories that you might like us to discuss on the show at reddit.com/r/This Week in Retro.
I'd like to welcome 5 new patrons. Thank you very much to Gavin, to Matt, to Plato, to Simon, and to Pascal. Thank you very much.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for signing up and being official twirlers. And don't forget, when you sign up at patreon.com/This Week in Retro, there's also a link to our Discord chat server where you get a special, is it pink or purple, Dave?
Magenta.
A special magenta coloured name so that everyone knows your status as an official twirler as you chat with us all day and every day. Thank you. Our guest on the last show, if you can remember back to last year, Aaron from the Amigos, forgot to mention the Amigos annual charity stream is very soon. Amigathon will be on Saturday, January the 18th. It will run from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. EST, which is Extreme Standard Time. Is that what that stands for?
Yes, extreme.
In real money, that's 1 p.m. GMT to 1 a.m. GMT. He says that, as always, they will be raising money for the Children's Miracle Network of Hospitals. You can donate to them right now at amigathon.com. And you can watch Amigathon on twitch.tv/Amigos Retro Gaming. Or on YouTube, just look for Amigos Retro Gaming there. Right now, the first $1,000 that are raised will be matched by who, Dave?
Retro Rewind. Frank is a good guy.
So that's really nice. And I should also say an extra thank you to Frank, who has sponsored a session at the cave for children who and families who can't necessarily afford a trip to the cave. So just a really nice guy. And Frank is giving the full weight of his support to the Amigos Amigathon. I believe Boat said that in 7 years of Amigathons, their audience has supported and raised over $30,000 US. So just an incredible effort, especially the professionalism that goes into these streams is really high. So this is not just another...
They try and pass it off as if they're just goofing about, but they really aren't. It's like a duck swimming in a pond. There's an awful lot going on beneath the water, although it looks calm on top. I always try and catch a good few hours of it as much as I can, and I always enjoy it. I know Neil tries to check in with it, and I've never been there and not seen Duncan. I think Duncan tries to help out all day with it.
Yeah, so a big shout out to the Amigathon, and whether you're going to watch it or not, please go and search for Amigos Retro Gaming or look at the links in the show note and go and subscribe to them and just keep an eye on what they're doing.
My briefs, Neil, are bulging this week.
I bet they are, Dave.
From Suspicious Visual 818 and seemingly nearly at the same time, 42 Nobody 42, a bakery in Indiana in the USA still uses Commodore 64s as cash registers. And why not? It's a simple task, and an 8-bit micro is certainly up to the job. It is, of course, the bread bin model.
Yes, I had to bite my tongue to see if you were going to say that, because I was going to blurt it out if not. The bread bin. Antiques for Geeks submits a BBC clip of Sarah Green. Remember her going down Tottenham Court Road in London looking at the games that were competing for the top spot as Christmas presents. Again, this seems to underline what we were talking about a moment ago, that around 1984 in the UK, all of a sudden, video games were a huge business.
More sad news, I'm afraid. Martin Brown, one of the Team 17 founders, passed away aged 57. So Alien Breed, Super Frog, Worms, all sorts of big Amiga games. His son Jack said, Martin passed away peacefully in his sleep at 8:17 a.m, 28th of December 2024, surrounded by his family, following a prolonged battle with a series of strokes. Know that he went out on his own terms, listening to his favourite music and surrounded by loved ones.
A video submitted by Arv explains how Elite works, the magic of the seeded universe, and all of the challenges that were overcome to make such a spectacular game.
I did watch the first part of it until it got too technical for me to understand, but even the first part of it is a wonderful explanation of what Elite is. And in more Elite news, there's a port underway to the humble VIC-20 of Elite, and I've actually looked at the video of this, and it looks fairly competent.
John over at RetroBytes has made a video of his top 5 microcomputers. There's a few references to This Week in Retro in the video, and he fully justifies his choices. It may not be exactly what Dave and I think should be in the top 5, but it's a very solid argument and a very well-made video, so go and check that out.
A really interesting link from Pretty AGA, and if we had time, I'd like to have discussed it in a full story on this.
Sure it's not Pretty Arga? Might really love that Arga.
Yeah, maybe it's about an oven.
Maybe.
It's from Tom's Hardware, and it's a CRT simulator from Blurbusters. Oasis? No. It uses an OLED screen at least 240...
Leave the crap jokes to me, Dave.
At least 240 hertz to simulate how a CRT looks. It's particularly interesting to me because it's not just doing the usual, which is a filter on an image, just changing how the image looks. It's relying on modern technology to emulate things. And sadly, unless I have the system requirements, which is a very high-performing GPU, and a display of 240 hertz, or better yet, 480 hertz, I can't see it in person. They do have a Q&A section, and it says, question, it looks amazing, how? Answer, algorithmic magic. It took 2 smart brains to combine. Mark Rajon's CRT Beam Simulator was combined with Timothy Lott's variable MPRT BFI algorithm that compresses MPRT for average brightness pixels and lengthens MPRT for brightest pixels.
What does MPRT stand for, Dave?
MPRT it stands for. So it's complicated. And like all display technology, you'd have to see it in person, but at least sounds as if it's more than just adding a bit of green onto the pixels around the one that's green.
It's a good start to my 30-year prediction, Dave. I was thinking that earlier on.
We're going to talk about that later on. We've said this before. Eventually, display technology will be able to recreate the things that we like about CRTs without doing the high-pitch whine, the eye strain, and the great big, massive, honking size of them, which is maybe a premonition, Neil.
Another submission from Arv, an article on Intel's Pentium division bug. Remember that? This is the original Pentium, and the article says it actually cost Intel $500 million. Incredible.
A cancelled Star Wars Battlefront 3 build from 16 years ago has been found, thanks to Pajako for letting us know.
Where did he find it?
I think he found it in that drawer. You know that drawer you've got that's got all the stuff in it? He was sorting through. It was a CD and no label on it. He thought it was blank, and he thought that'll do to put my Christmas playlist on for driving to his parents in the car.
Yeah,
and he got it out. Turns out it wasn't blank. Thought, I wonder what this says. Stuck it in. Autoplay started. Star Wars Battlefront
3 build. Well done, Paul. Well done. Also from Vajako, an article in Go210 Retro about the Atari ST and DOS computers and their shared operating system, GEM-DOS, and why that was the case.
Yeah, Reese has done videos on that before. And not submitted to us, I don't know why, but it's some pretty important news for some, that there's a new RetroTink coming out, which I understand is a cut-down version of the flagship one, still using the same platform, but not using as powerful an FPGA. It's still not cheap, but it's $475 compared to the $750 for the flagship model. So maybe that will tip the balance for people who want it. Obviously, some features missing, but because it's using the same platform, it means that they'll still be able to share updates and so on. There's over 100 articles submitted in the subreddit, even though we were on Christmas break. So if you need something to fill your time and have a browse, what is the URL, Neil?
The URL is reddit.com/r/thisweekinretro. Bookmark it, set it as your browser's start page. Don't let a day go by without checking it.
It's no secret that I love CRTs. In fact, I've got over 20 CRTs. I need to stop buying them. There's a 21-inch CRT in my living room, and it's now waiting until my garage is converted to go back in use. But it's incredibly heavy and awkward. Now, Neil, I know that 21 inches is nothing for you. What's the biggest CRT you've got in the cave?
There is a Mitsubishi CRT in the cave, which is used to demo Heber's multi-system and their multi-pie system. It's got its own flight case that it goes in, which we lugged it up the stairs in. And I'm pretty sure it's a 29-inch model, which is pretty big and very heavy. Yeah, beautiful though.
Yeah, I reckon I could carry it, but lifting it up and putting it down or carrying it upstairs, I don't think so. I should give a little bit of an explanation here. You might reasonably think that a 13-inch CRT is half the size of a 26-inch CRT, but it's not. That isn't how it works. A 26-inch CRT is actually 4 times the screen size of a 13-inch CRT. So that little 13-inch portable TV that many of us had our STs and Amigas and Spectrums connected to is a lot smaller than that 21-inch living room, 21-inch monitor in my living room. In fact, the 21-inch TV is 2.5 times the screen size of a 13-inch monitor. Now, thanks to Happy Coding ZX for this submission, there is a holy grail in the CRT community, and that is the Sony KX45ED1, also known as the PVM 4300. It is 45 inches in size. It's the biggest monitor of its kind ever made, biggest TV ever made, and that happens to be exactly 12 times the screen area of that 13-inch portable. So you'd need 12 of those 13-inch portables to get the same size of image. It's difficult to put into words just how big this is. And it's not light either. As you might imagine, it's heavy. It's 200 kilograms, which is around the same weight as a male lion and probably just as difficult to move around. Shank Mods is a CRT enthusiast who's made a video on his struggles of getting hold of one of these, importing it from Japan, and then going through a great deal of work and collaboration with experts to get it fixed and calibrated and adjusted. Do you think Holly could do that? I think Holly could sort it all out herself.
Yeah.
And all through that video, I just struggle with the scale of it. The problem is, it looks like a TV, and until you see something next to it, all TVs look the same because the same basic shape. It's only when you place it next to something do you see the absolute staggering size of it. So what did you think, Neil, and how big would you want to go in the cave?
Well, yeah, it's huge. I would love to have one of these, but beyond a certain size, the issue is no longer the CRT, it's the furniture that you put it on. So can the table take 200 kilograms? I think that becomes the problem. The limit for the cave, really, or the limit I've set, is one of those 32-inch Sony widescreens that were pretty popular at the time, because for me, that was peak CRT for the PlayStation 2 era. It was a huge screen. It demanded a proper wooden corner unit for your lounge before we hung TVs on walls. It had to take the depth of the CRT, so in the corner of your lounge. And if you had 32, I know there were bigger ones around, but 32 was kind of the sweet spot. If you had one of those when the PS2 came out, you were doing well for yourself. That was pretty impressive. Your mates would be round to yours to play on that system, to play Fantavision until some decent games actually came out for the PlayStation 2. I remember it well. And I've got a couple of those. I've already got them up to the top floor, done the hard bit. So soon I'll recreate that setup and we'll have a PS2, or what else would go with that? Xbox 360. Yeah. Xbox, get those set up. So we will get those up and running soon. So yeah,
a PC playing, there's some widescreen games that would suit a CRT.
PC,
yeah.
Well, on a 15 kilohertz television, it's always a bit naff, a bit iffy. You need the right video card to get that kind of output.
True. I'm thinking monitors 85. Yeah. No, that wouldn't work. I like there's a particular part of the cave where you can sit and you can play. I think there's a big brown chair, brown leather chair, and some stools. Yeah, big chair. You can sit in a big chair, and there's a great big CRT in front of you. It's a PVM, I believe.
Yeah.
And I don't know what size it is.
It's a Sony
It's
one.
massive.
It's about 27, something like that. Yeah.
It's fantastic. It's great. It's a great big beefy TV to sit down there. So 45 inches would be ridiculous. I don't think it would be out of place in the cave. I think if someone gave you one of those, you could reinforce a table to put it on, and people could gather round with the mister, and they could play with 8 players in whichever game support it. That would be
Do you know
fun.
what my concern would be? It would be such a draw to come and see this beast and play on this beast that I would disappoint people if it went wrong or if it went down for maintenance and I had to fix it again. You know,
Got you.
It would be
Yeah.
quite an attraction to come and see this thing, wouldn't it? But, you know,
Yeah.
that's the challenge of running a museum.
Well, all you do then is you get the scissors out and you cut a new screen to stick on the front of it.
Exactly. Give me 30 years. Promise you it'll be a thing.
There's a link in the show notes. It's a wonderful video, but especially, I cannot recommend the end of the video enough. It's a masterclass in trolling. That alone makes it worth it, and I won't spoil a single bit of the end of it. It's just perfect.
Time now for our community question of the week from the last show. And after a bit of chaos and a few suggestions for the question, it was left to the very sensible Aaron to come up with the following. As we hit episode 200 at the very end of the year, we would like to ask for your favourite moments from the first 200 shows. Dave, have we got some good answers in there today?
We've certainly got some answers. We've got lots and lots and lots and lots of answers. Shall we start off with Starcade 2084? And he says, I like that one time you mentioned Ultima.
You're going to have to narrow it down a bit.
Someone says, Ori Gunner says, I missed the Ultima count at the end of every show. I know it drove Duncan a little batty. That's not true. It drove Duncan a lot batty. But that was part of the amusement knowing that.
Happy Coding ZX says, Daddy Mulk. Daddy Mulk. Perhaps Duncan can drop in a little clip of that just to remind everyone.
You have to drop your trousers and dance. Daddy Mo, Daddy Mo. I've actually made him my Daddy Mo. But you get a premium experience out of these things.
I remember.
This is super thick stuff. Daddy Mo, Daddy Mo. I've actually made him my Daddy Mo.
More malt, Daddy.
Did you guys put this in here? I'm sure they're going to be happy with it. I can double fist Daddy Mo. Daddy Mo. Daddy Mo. Daddy Mo. I've actually made him my Daddy Mo.
I just wanted to know I could keep my pants.
So that's This Week in Chris. Did Chris just want me to drop my trousers? Daddy Mo. Daddy Mo. I've actually made him my Daddy Mo.
More malt, Daddy.
You guys put this in here. I'm sure they're going to be happy with it.
Richard Shears says the return of Chris was a joy. Dave has been a legend. Has been. We all love Neil.
Thank you.
But for me, each and every guest has been amazing. I don't want to single anyone out as that would be unfair. So instead, I will leave it there. Thank you all. Oh, and the best of 25 will be keeping creative alive. And now that I've given you that terrible slogan, I'll shut up.
Thank you, Richard. And of course, the best answer in all of these comes from Lord Borak. Says, all of Neil's awesome dad jokes and impressions, especially his impression of Duncan. Oh, yeah.
How does that sound? Yeah.
Yeah. My name's Duncan and I'm doing the editing. You
Christ, why
muppets.
don't you says, why do you says, Dave's belly laugh. He often laughs, but when he really goes, it's a thing of beauty. He says, anytime you make me laugh, basically, crafty love.
Fantastic. So many great answers. So please do go and have a scroll through those. And that
That's a nice comment about your adoption.
Where's that one then? I haven't missed that. I'll go. Do you know what? I'll go to the subreddit and I'll go and read that in just a minute after the show. So thank you.
My favourite moment was in episode 186, where Dave thoroughly confused Mr. Lutch about the Rouge shoes.
Oh, I remember laughing to that one. I'm not sure. I don't think I was on that show, was I? But I remember listening back to it. Yeah. Fantastic.
Someone remembered my logo command. Oh, and then someone calling the activist Duncan was the highlight of my year. Week in and week out, he's been amazing, even when he was on holiday. The others can take them or leave them.
Oh.
Banned.
So that brings us to our question of the week this week, which is, what is your prediction for technology in 30 years' time? Go wild. What do you want to see? What will it do? Will it make our lives easier? And will we be taxed on it? All of your suggestions. Go on, Dave.
You will not be taxed by submitting a question. An answer.
So you will find that pinned at our subreddit, reddit.com/r/thisweekinretro. Don't forget, if you want to start the new year by supporting what we do, head to patreon.com. You say it, Dave. I always say it. Where do they go?
They go to patreon.com/thisweekinretro.
There you go. Go there. Pledge your support and enjoy your weeks. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for taking the time to listen, everyone. And see you soon. Take care. He's waving.
This Week in Retro was presented by Neil from RMC The Cave and Dave. It was produced by me, Duncan Styles. The podcast version of the show is available through your favourite podcaster, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And the video version is available on the This Week in Retro YouTube channel.
Join our community subreddit at r/thisweekinretro to suggest and vote on the stories we cover on the show. If you watch This Week in Retro on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe to help us reach new viewers.
If you enjoy our show and would like to support it, then please check out the link to our Patreon page in the show notes or description. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time for more up-to-date news for out-of-date tech.